So thank you so much for hosting this teaching symposium. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Yuthika Girme. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, and I'm going to be talking about teaching as an opportunity for dialogue. So we were posed with this question about, why do we care about teaching? What inspires us about teaching? And one of the reasons that I personally really care about teaching is because it provides me with an avenue to engage in and encourage dialogue with my students about important psychological processes. To me, this is really special. Not only do students feel connected to and engage with the material they are learning about, but it's always a learning opportunity for me as a teacher as well. And in fact, when teaching my courses on close relationships and individual differences, my lectures tend to be heavily orientated around open and respectful, as well as being critical of the different types of perspectives and discourses that we're discussing. Unfortunately, this has also created a really big challenge for me in the last 18 months. March 12th, 2020, there's sort of chatter around our offices about switching our teaching to online and remote learning contexts. And immediately, I began to think about how I can continue to encourage dialogue in this context of remote teaching. But also what was really important to me was how I can accommodate other challenges that students might also be facing and we're also starting to communicate. Issues around IT infrastructure and balancing home, work, and school life. And in thinking about this, I sort of started having like a little bit of a eureka moment. And I thought, what one way we could, or that I could try and adopt this sort of issue around dialogue in my class is to conduct podcast lectures. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a podcast is an audio program. It's just like talk radio. We subscribe and you put it on your phone and you listen to it whenever you like. And this medium had a lot of advantages that I really liked. It required much less internet bandwidth than the typical video PowerPoint presentation streaming of lectures. It allowed flexibility for asynchronous learning. And because it was on a mobile device, it allowed people to listen in without restricting their movement in any way. But for me, a big part of a podcast lecture is that it also allowed me to continue engaging in dialogue via conversations with co-hosts. And in the spirit of open dialogue, I actually opened this alternative to my students that were taking my courses at the time. So here's me sort of live tweeting. It's March 13th, 2020. And I say that I'm currently polling my students about their preferences for online learning and how my husband doesn't know it yet, but it looks like we're about to crack open a bottle of wine tonight and make some conversational podcasts for my close relationships and individual difference course. So what my students were telling me, so this was a poll of nearly 300 students at the time, over 80% of them wanted to go online and they actually preferred a podcast styled lecture. And that's how Merlot with My Beau was born. This podcast essentially comprised of my husband, Steve, as you can see here, and I, at the end of the day, after we've put our 18-month-old toddler to bed, sitting down with some wine and beer and essentially just talking through my discussion slides. My lecture slides. When possible, I also made an effort to invite local, national, and internationally based scholars that I was teaching their material about anyway to join us on the podcast and talk about their perspectives about their research. The podcast has actually been a really great teaching tool in my experience. But what's been great is to reflect back on students' discussions and their course evaluations. And here's how I feel like the podcast lectures have been a successful tool for encouraging this continued dialogue with students, even within a remote environment. So one theme that seemed to kind of come up time and time again is that the conversational style of the podcast lectures made it easy for students to engage with. So for example, one student here noted how since the materials were presented as a conversation, it makes it very engaging for the student to listen. Another theme that came up was that students felt that their questions that they may have been thinking about were actually answered due to the podcast lecture being quite conversational. So this student, for example, said that the podcasts were perfect for online learning because Steve had a lot of questions or comments that were on my mind too. And finally, a theme that I'm actually really excited about, I wasn't expecting this to happen, is that the podcast lecture also created an ongoing dialogue for students to continue with their friends and family. I had a lot of students tell me that they were listening to the podcast lectures with their roommates, their friends, their partners, their parents, that they were in isolation and lockdown with. One student said that I constantly talk about this class with my friends and partner and even listen to the podcasts with him. So that was really neat to see how students were able to engage in the course material, even outside of the teaching time. There are a whole host of other pedagogical related pros and cons to this type of lecturing. I'm not going to have time to go through it, but if anyone did want to talk a little bit more about this with me, I'd be happy to do so. And finally, I just want to give thanks. I believe a land acknowledgement has already been given, so I won't repeat that. But I also want to thank Dr. Lesley Cormack for establishing this award, the Cormack Adjudication Committee, and also the Departments of Psychology for their support.